Alright, so hello, I am Saber, and welcome to my pre-release prep video. So every time a new set comes out, I like to go over all of the instance spells with flash and wrath effects that are in the set. I think out of all of the cards that you lose to early in a set that you don't lose to later in the set, those are the most common ones that you need to learn that they're in the set in order to be able to play around them properly. So I'm going to go over each one of the cards. A lot of the how do you play around this is be aware of it. If you know that it's a possibility that your opponent can cast the spell because they have this amount of mana open, then that's half the battle right there. But we're going to go over all of them. This one's going to be a little bit longer, I think. White and blue have so many instants and spells with flash on them compared to the other colors and compared to most sets. So there seems to be a higher than average ratio. So my voice is going to go long before we get to the end of this one. All right, so our first one is Cathar Commando. So this is a reprint from one of the Innistrad sets. It's a 2-mana 3/1 with flash, and then has the ability to pay 1 to sacrifice and destroy target artifact or enchantment. So it is not only a creature that can suddenly pop out to block your 3-power cool creature that's attacking, or 3-toughness cool creature that's attacking. It can also suddenly show up and destroy your artifact or enchantment that's giving your team a buff, or something along those lines. That being said, it's a 1 toughness creature, so it's only going to trade with your things. It's never going to just eat one of them. Unless you're attacking with a 0-power creature for some reason, but I don't think there's a Tamiyo, like front face of Tamiyo style card where you want to attack with it even though it has no power, so. Also worth noting, it can flash out at the end of the opponent, or end of your turn, so that on your opponent's turn it can attack you. So that's another factor, is that they might have one more attacker than you thought, but that's true for a lot of the flash creatures, and we're going to see a bunch more, like I said. Celestial Armor is an equipment that has flash and auto attaches when it comes into play, so it can immediately come into play and attach to one of their creatures, and it gives the equipped creature +2/+0 and flying. But also, the turn that it enters, it gives the creature hexproof and indestructible. So their creature will suddenly have +2/+0, flying, hexproof, and indestructible. So that will save it from your targeted removal, your mass board wipes, and allow them to block your flying creature mid-combat. It is a rare, but this is one of the more brutal things they can ambush you with. Fortunately, after that, it's only +2/+0 and flying, so it's not that powerful of equipment after it's in play, but that one turn is going to be really bad. Fortunately, it's 3 mana, and leaving 3 mana up to protect your creature is a lot, so if you can wait, they might have to just cast this to get the power boost and the flying on their creature, and not try and get the 2-for-1 of canceling out your removal spell and still having the equipment there to boost their creatures. Claws Out is a 5-mana mass pump spell, giving all of your creatures +2/+2, but it also has a cost reduction effect. And that cost reduction is based on the number of cats the caster controls. And there are a fair number of cats in this set. So if your opponent has cats in play, keep in mind this is a 2 mana potentially +2/+2 to their team. They need 3 cats in play to get it down that low, but if they're leaving up double white, especially on the arena tells, like if they go to cast their spell and it insists on leaving up double white all of the time, then it could be this thing. Like I said, it's going to ambush you more in the cats deck than anything else. Leaving up 5 mana. 5 mana when they attack all, when they don't have a lot of cats, is pretty obvious that they're trying to do a mass pump spell like this. In order to play around mass pump spells, what you have to do when they're going on the offensive is you assign blockers based on the idea that they will have this spell. So you don't put your 2/2 on their 2/2. You put like your 5/5 on their 2/2 and maybe chump their 4/4 with one of your 1/1s. Things like that. You try and organize the blockers so that if they cast this, it does the least amount of damage to you, while still killing as many of their creatures as you can if they don't have this. And not dying if they did cast this and you left certain creatures unblocked. So, first figure out that you don't die if they have it, then figure out how best to block their creatures so that they do the least amount of damage with a card like this. Fortunately, I think it's the only mass pump spell in white, so at least we don't have to play around multiples. This set is like all over the place, as far as like sometimes there are redundant effects, like Overrun and a new, bigger, higher casting cost Overrun are both in the set, so. Alright, this brings us to our first mass removal spell, which is Day of Judgment. It is as close to the classic as we get nowadays. Wrath of God doesn't really change compared to Day of Judgment, except for the fact that Wrath of God doesn't allow regeneration, and regeneration isn't really a thing anymore. So they could print Wrath of God, but then it's going to have some trinket text that's going to confuse newer players, and that's not what this set is about. So it is the classic. It is 4 mana, kill all creatures, no drawbacks, no buffs, no anything. So just be aware that your opponent on 4 mana can have access to this if they're in white. There aren't a lot of Wraths in the set. There's only like 2 real ones and a couple of situational ones. So there's not a whole lot of Wraths to worry about, but this is one of them, and it is just a regular rare, so you will play against it a lot more often than you think you would. It is more likely of a threat to happen, especially on Arena, where you're going to be playing against people out of your pod. So just be aware that as early as turn 4, they can wipe the board, so your time to build out your board safely and get in all that extra damage before they have access to a Wrath is a lot lower if you're playing against white than it has been in a lot of sets, and you won't be able to set up a situation where you get like a free card out of it or something, or where they might not be able to kill all of your stuff, like some of the other 4 mana Wraths have been in recent sets. After that comes Divine Resilience. So this is the 1 mana trick that saves a creature. In this case, it gives the creature indestructible and only indestructible until end of turn. But it's at uncommon because it has kicker for 2 and a white, and so at 4 mana, it gives all of their creatures indestructible if they want them to. Any number of targets gain indestructible instead. So this can counter your Wrath. It can blow you out in combat by letting all your creatures survive. This is very similar, like how you survive this when they're attacking with all versus how you survive Claws Out. If you're blocking in such a way that Claws Out is not going to kill you, you are probably blocking correctly so that this thing doesn't ruin you also. Like, they're going to save all of their attacking creatures, but they're not going to deal you any extra damage, and they're not going to kill anything that they weren't going to kill already. Like, there's no power boost or anything. So it's just a matter of your trades will no longer be trades, and you won't actually get to eat any of their stuff. So be aware of that, but if you're playing around Claws Out properly, you're playing around this one properly too most of the time. After Claws, Day of Judgment, Resilience. Next up is Fleeting Flight. So 1 mana, put a 1/1 counter on target creature, it gains flying and prevent all combat damage that will be dealt to it this turn. This is more of the typical 1 mana trick. It's doing a lot all at once for one creature, without the ability to ever do anything for anything else. So the biggest problem with tricks like this for me is that I try to force out the trick early on when it's inconvenient for the opponent. It's much better if you trade your 2/2 on like turn 2 or 3 for their 1 mana trick than if you for like trying to block and kill their 2-drop, than it is trading your like 5-drop for their trick, or their trick and like one of their medium creatures. So I tend to try to force them to use the combat trick. Like if they're attacking their 2/2 into my 3/3, it's like, yeah, I'd rather you lose the giant growth or whatever now than have it later when it will still be really powerful. The thing is, this one leaves behind the +1/+1 counter, and so that can be a little bit frustrating. It's still better to have a 1/1 counter on a smaller creature than it is to have it on a larger creature and have it live through a combat, though. And it will always live through the combat because you prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to it this turn. So just be aware that if you're trying to bait out the trick, you want to make sure either that your creature lives or that you're okay losing your creature and theirs being bigger for the remainder of the game. If you're not, then it might be better to wait a little while longer. But I usually try and bait out the tricks early, and the ones that leave behind permanent bonuses are the ones that mess me up the most. So this is one of those ones where I'm going to be a little bit more aware of it and give it a little wider berth than I need to. Very similar to playing around the +2/+2 and trample trick from Duskmourn. A lot of times tricks like that aren't actually that good because they're expensive to compensate for the fact that the creature is staying permanently buffed. But at the same time, there were a lot of if you played the green-white survival deck, which was considered a very low-power deck, and therefore I got it a lot and got the good cards for it a lot, you ran the risk of running into that card a lot more than you should, and it did do its job. So I am always hyper-aware of cards that leave behind a permanent bonus for the creature and let them win combat. Herald of the Eternal Dawn is next. Now, this one is a mythic, but wow, is it going to wreck you when it actually comes up. So it's a 7-mana 6/6 flyer with flash, so it can already come down and eat a creature pretty easily. But more importantly, it is a Platinum Angel. You can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game while this card is in play. So an attack for lethal where you don't have creature removal, especially at instant speed, but even post-combat, will not kill your opponent if this thing comes down. Even if they take all of the damage and go to -35, they now have a clear board to attack you back on, and they have an additional 6/6 flyer to hit you with. So if your opponent seems to be dead on board and they're just passing with all of their mana up, do be aware of this card, because while it is a mythic, that is the one thing that is going to save them. So you need to try to get them to 0 or less, and then try to find the removal spell before they can kill you. But if you're going to leave yourself dead on board to attacking into this thing to try and win the game, just be aware that it's a possibility and try to avoid getting yourself in that situation, because you can probably still win the game if it's that close, if you can kill the flyer. But if you attack into it and lose one of your guys and don't have any blockers now, even if you're not dead on the crackback, that still might be really bad for you. So this is one of those ones where you really just need to be aware of it. But it's 7 mana, so it's not going to come, and it's a mythic, it's not going to come up super often, but when you're winning and you don't know why your opponent hasn't conceded yet, consider this card. This might be the answer. And you definitely will lose if you don't play around it. Joust Through. This is a very common type of removal spell that we see in a lot of draft sets. It's been a little less prevalent since the switch over to play boosters because there's less room normally for cards like this, but it's a very efficient, if not particularly exciting, removal spell that white typically gets. So it's 1 mana, 3 damage to an attacking or blocking creature, and you gain 1 life. So a lot of times white aggro decks don't want a card like this because it allows the opponent to block still and then deals the 3 damage to their creature, so they're not pushing in extra damage. But the more controlling and turtling decks will look for a card like this to stop early aggressive creatures and pad their life total a tiny bit. So If you're playing against a more controlling looking deck, especially worry about this card. Like, don't attack your really strong, efficient creature into it if you don't have to. But if you have a lot of disposable, like 1 and 2 mana creatures that are like, yeah, they're decent, but they're not gonna do a whole lot, then by all means attack with them. Just don't send in your 3/3 card advantage creature into this thing if you don't have to. Next up is Luminous Rebuke. So this is, if it's not Cease from Slumber, it is very nearly Cease from Slumber from Duskmourn. So, same issue, it costs 3 mana less if it targets a tapped creature and it destroys target creature. You're always going to run into these in Limited, because removal, like efficient removal, is always going to get played. So it can kill a creature that just got declared as an attacker. It can kill one if they top deck it afterwards for 2 mana on their turn. And later in the game, it can just reach out and kill anything. So another one of those, it's going to kill your best attacker early on, and then later on it will just kill your best creature, even if you don't attack with it. So be aware that you might be sending your best creature to die against this thing, even if it has 4 toughness. Now the Joust Through isn't going to kill it, but this one definitely will. And at 2 mana, effectively, it's going to be just as likely the card that they're holding up as Joust Through is a lot of the time. So next up is Make Your Move. This is more the type of removal spells we've been getting in play boosters. So this destroys an artifact, enchantment, or creature with power 4 or greater. They like to put in more versatile removal spells in the newer sets because they have less slots for cards than they used to. There's both one less card in the pack, and there are fewer commons and more uncommons, so they need the common cards to do a lot more heavy lifting. Whenever you get a pack that has like an extra rare in it or an extra uncommon in it, it's because it has one less common in it. So so the commons that they do have, they usually try and make them do a little more. Also, Best of One is their flagship thing on Arena because it makes the games go quicker, like the matches go quicker, and that lets people get back into a queue faster, and Wizards make more money, so they push Best of One pretty hard. So they do like to make the cards better for Best of One if they're going to insist that you play that format as best they can. So Make Your Move is a reprint. The only things to think about with this one are things like putting an equipment on your decent evasive creature might put it in range of Make Your Move, like the +2/+0 from the one that we were looking at earlier, Celestial Armor, might now make your 2 power flyer a 4 power flyer, and that puts it in range of Make Your Move. So there's that to consider, but only in situations where you don't need to do it. There's a lot of, if you don't know the card exists and you're not thinking it or you're not thinking about it, you just do things because it's like, oh yeah, it doesn't change the clock on the creature right now, and it just makes it bigger, so we're just going to put the equipment on in an attack, and then they kill it where they wouldn't have been able to before. So if you're thinking about that, you at least know it's a possibility, and then you can decide. If you're making informed decisions, you're doing a lot better than if you're just, oh, I'm going to just throw all of this stuff onto my one guy and make it huge, and then it dies to a card that it couldn't die to before, and it was already an evasive threat that was going to kill them pretty quickly. You know, you run into situations like that from time to time. Also, be aware because it can kill artifacts and enchantments, which if there are any that are changing your combat math, this is another way that it can just suddenly go sideways for you. So keep that one in mind also. Next up is Mischievous Pup. So this one is another 3/1 with Flash. This time it costs 3 mana. And its ability is to return up to one other target permanent you control to owner's hand. So this one doubles as a way to protect your more important permanents from the opponent's targeted removal spells, and their mass removal if it's really that big a deal, where you'd rather lose your 3/1 than the other creature that you're going to bounce back to your hand. It can also be used as a rebuy for enters the battlefield triggers and all of that sort of thing. So this is one of those ones where it will not only save their creature, but if their creature has a good comes into play ability, or if there are other stuff it triggers off of creatures coming into play, you're going to suffer all of that if you're not prepared for Mischievous Pup. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do other than kill the creature twice if you're in that situation. So sometimes the best thing is to just make sure that they can't replay the creature now while it's problematic. So, maybe don't do it on their main phase. Unless the creature has an attack trigger, then you might have to do it on their main phase to stop them from getting the attack trigger. Again, a lot of the cards are you're keeping in mind that the cards exist, so that way you don't just lose to them. But sometimes you can't play around a card. Sometimes you just have to do the thing and hope they don't have it. And sometimes you just have to go for the kill spell on their creature and hope they don't have the Mischievous Pup, or the Divine Resilience, or the Celestial Armor, any of these things that are going to randomly save their creature where it would normally die. Next up is Resolute Reinforcements. We actually see this type of effect a lot in white. The 2 to 3 mana make 2 bodies spell shows up a lot in white and sometimes in red, and we'll actually see a 3 mana version later on. So what these tend to do is pop out and ambush either 2 of your 1 toughness creatures or 1 of your 2 toughness creatures. They can also come down at the end of your turn, especially if the player has a lot of mass pump effects, like the Claws Out, or there's an enchantment later on that buffs all of your creatures. It's an Anthem effect. So that is the kill your guys play with that thing. But a lot of times what Resolute Reinforcements does is it just comes down in the middle of combat and trades for either 1 or 2 of your creatures. So be aware of it more for that effect than for the surprise attackers later on, but they can also do that. But that's pretty much the same as the Cathar Commando and whatnot, where it's just like, yeah, it's a flash creature, so it can come out end of turn and then be there to attack. But it's a lot more impressive when it suddenly shows up and the token blocks your Cathar Commando mid-combat, or your Savannah Lions, or anything else, and then they have another 1/1 after that to do stuff with. Or they both show up and kill your 2/2 that you didn't think was going to be able to die here. Fortunately, because of the Joust Through and the Luminous Rebuke, you're already probably aware that your creature might die, so the fact that it's dying to this thing rather than one of those doesn't really change a whole lot, other than the fact that they might have a 1/1 left over afterwards, depending on the toughness of the creature you attacked with. Alright, Mischievous Pup, Resolute Reinforcements, Stroke of Midnight is next. So, Stroke is one of those cards that performs very well in formats like Commander, where the 1/1 is so negligible that it doesn't even really count as a drawback. The card is too versatile, so you will see this card get played. I mean, people play Beast Within a lot in Commander because the 3/3 doesn't super matter compared to the things that you're killing. In Limited, killing your opponent's creature and leaving them with an actual body that they can still attack and block with is a lot worse. Like, a lot worse. But you're still going to play against this card from time to time because it kills anything. And there are plenty of cards in the set still that a 1/1 is just negligible compared to that, and they don't have any other options because it's limited. They grabbed a Stroke of Midnight just in case, and they didn't get any other good removal, so they kind of have to run it. So you have to be aware of it. One of the other weird things about Stroke of Midnight is that it can kill one of your own things and produce a 1/1 chump blocker out of nowhere, which most of the time you're going to kill your opponent's stuff, but if it's something like Alenda, who has protection from instants, Then they might have to kill one of their other things in order to make a 1/1 so that they can get in her way so that they don't die. And so that, now they don't have to block with one of their other better creatures that can swing back. So that is a thing to be aware of, but it's almost never going to come up. It will almost always kill the one creature rather than kill one of their things and create a blocker for them. But it is something it can still do in the scenarios where that's like their only real option. And unfortunately, I think Alenda is like the only way that's actually going to ever come up. But let me discuss it now so I can use up more of my voice so that way I die later on. So much talking. Alright. Next up is Twin Blade Blessing. We're almost through the white cards. In fact, this is the last one that has flash. It's 3 mana, and it gives enchanted creature double strike. It's worth noting this does not give a power boost, so at least you don't have to worry about that. The downside is, of course, things that we're going to trade aren't going to trade anymore, because they will now double strike through your creature. It makes multi-blocking a lot worse if the surviving creatures can't still kill the enchanted creature. So those are factors to consider. It is a 3 mana spell, though, so very similar to the +2/+2 and trample trick from Duskmourn. It's going to be one of those things that ambushes me, and I'm going to be upset about it, but most of the time it's not going to be that bad. Also, unless it's going on a large trampling creature or a death touch creature, it's not really doing a whole lot other than killing your blocker, so in that regard, it functions a lot more like a removal spell for a blocking creature. And then later on, you'll be aware of the creature having double strike and be able to play around it as appropriate. Alright, that brings us to blue, and blue starts off with one of the most impactful cards that it has available to it. So this is Aetherize. It's a 4 mana instant, and it returns all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. So, what this does is it ruins your combat, puts all of your creatures off the board, so now you have to spend the mana to redeploy them, saves your opponent, and possibly exposes you to a lethal counterattack. To play around this, first and foremost, if you already have lethal, don't go spending all of your mana, because if it is Aetherize, then you're going to need to redeploy your creatures that turn, if possible. So don't cast anything else just because. Don't do your dailies because you're about to win the game, because you might not be about to win the game if it's Aetherize and you don't have mana anymore. Other than that, not attacking with unnecessary creatures. Like, if you're going to get through in the air for lethal damage, don't push with your ground guys that they'll have to, like, chump and trade with at that point. Because if they're already facing lethal in the air, you don't have to expose yourself to getting all of your ground creatures aetherized also. And if they use, like, a bounce spell or something to stop your flyers from being lethal, that's probably still okay. Like one of the other spells on the list. Just so long as you don't get your entire board bounced by Aetherize and leave yourself vulnerable, I think you're going to be okay, but this is an uncommon. So you're going to play against this one a lot. You're going to have lethal damage, and the opponent's going to leave up 4 mana, and you're going to go, oh god, it's Aetherize, how do I attack properly so that they kind of have to use it, or waste their mana each turn, like leave up 4 mana each turn, to hold up the Aetherize so that they don't die to my all-out swing. And in that regard, it's kind of like a counterspell. If you can force them to waste the mana, you're actually doing a lot for yourself. Like, if they can't develop out to their board because they have to leave up Aetherize every single turn to not be dead, and you can push a little bit of damage, or force them to use it on anything less impressive, then you're doing fine. It's when you attack all and they go Aetherize because you didn't know it was in the set that you lose the game on the spot. So that's why we're doing this video. This is one of the cards that you will absolutely lose to if you don't know it's in the set. Next up is an offer you can't refuse. It's a very, very cheap counterspell. It can only hit non-creature spells, but it's not as punishing to leave up 1 blue mana a lot of the time, and it will get the spells. It'll counter the things like the Aetherize, the Day of Judgment, the things that would save all of their stuff or win them the game outright. So it's very hard to make them waste the mana. Wasting 1 blue mana usually doesn't matter that much. So it's not so much playing around this one as accepting that it might be the thing that counters your spell. If you have 2 decently strong non-creature spells, lead with the weaker one against an opponent that's always leaving up 1 blue mana, just to try to get them to counter the wrong one. But past that, you can't really do much if you only have the 1 good non-creature spell to begin with. And yeah, normally the trick is making them waste their mana. Like, don't cast a spell into like their 2 or 3 mana counter spell if you don't have to, and then they've left up mana that they didn't get to use, and you're still ahead on board. The downside to that kind of strategy against counter spells is our next card, Arcane Epiphany. So, costs 1 less to cast if you control a wizard. It's 2 blue and 3 at its base, and it draws 3 cards. So, trying to make opponents waste mana does not work if they have other things they can do with their mana when you don't cast a spell. So, cards like Arcane Epiphany to draw them cards, and creatures with flash to develop out their board kind of throw a monkey wrench into the usual try and make the opponent waste mana for their counterspells. And there are a lot of other options besides counterspell in this set for blue, so blue seems a little bit more well positioned than normal for its counterspells. Our first one up isn't that impressive. It's Brineborn Cutthroat. So it's a 2 mana 2/1 with flash, so it can pop out, but trade for a 1 or 2 power, 1 or 2 toughness creature. Might not be able to trade for a 1/3. But on top of that, if you can cast any other spells during an opponent's turn, this gets a 1/1 counter. So not only is it capable of ambushing an opponent's thing in combat, it also might grow in the middle of combat. So not only do you have to worry about this one, you have to worry about all of the other spells that have flash, for our instance, that could grow this thing. But for the most part, it's going to be a 2 mana 2/1, very similar to the Cathar without the artifact or enchantment destruction effect. After that one comes Elementalist Adept. Very similar to the Brineborn, it is a 2 mana 2/1 with flash, and this one has prowess. So whereas this one gets a 1/1 counter for casting spells on your opponent's turn, this one gets +1/+1 for casting non-creature spells. There's a lot of overlap there. So, yeah, you've got 2 entirely different 2 mana 2/1 blue creatures that could suddenly show up, and if the opponent has more mana, could also suddenly grow. So, at least it doesn't take up a whole lot more mental space to keep those in your head, because they're basically the same card for a lot of effects. That brings us to our first counterspell. No, wait. Offer You Can't Refuse was our first counterspell. That brings us to our second counterspell. It's Essence Scatter. Very similar to Offer You Can't Refuse, except that it costs twice as much mana and hits creatures instead. This is the one where you kind of want your opponent to waste the mana if you have good creatures that you don't need to get countered. But you should run out your medium creatures into it just to get them to use it so they don't have it in the mid to late game to counter your bomby creature that you finally drew. But yeah, if you don't need to run your cards into it, you don't run your cards into it, and that stops them from developing out to their board if they have to leave up 2 mana every single turn to worry about your creatures, and it doesn't let them spend their mana efficiently. the ideal is that they can't just not do anything. So if they leave up the mana because they don't have a 2-drop, when they draw their 3-drop or have a 3-drop in their hand next turn, they kind of have to cast it because they didn't do anything on turn 2, and you're getting to attack them now with your 2-drop. So ideally you can get them to not ever be able to cast their Essence Scatter for value. But if you can't get into that position, then getting them to counter like a 2 or 3-drop instead of like your 6 or 7 down the line is probably your best bet. Next up is Feybloom Trick. Oh right, blue also got one of these, didn't they? So 3 mana, makes 2 1/1 fairies with flying, and taps target creature an opponent controls. So for 3 mana, it's surprise 2 1/1s, or it can tap one of their attacking creature, like one of their potential attackers before combat, and present 2 additional blockers, or it can tap their creature and now present 2 additional attackers on the next turn. Or yeah, it can tap their creature pre-combat. It can also tap their creature end of turn, and then present 2 additional attackers too, which is even more brutal if that's where you're at. If that's the best play, that might be even worse for the person facing down the Feybloom Trick, because they were counting on that one creature being back to block. So yeah, it plays a lot like the make 2 1/1s, except that it can also do other stuff. Fleeting Distraction. So this is a weird one. Normally players don't want to play with these. But if the math works out in this set, if there's a lot of creatures have just the right power a lot of the time, then this thing becomes a good role player. It will also show up in Spells Matter decks because it's very cheap, can be cast at basically any time, and replaces itself. So it doesn't cost a card in your deck, or it costs a card in your deck, it doesn't cost a card in your hand a lot of the time, though. So it's very easy to cycle this to get a card. So like early on, if you need to hit your land drops, it's very easy to go blue, target anything on the board, give it -1 power, and just draw a card to try and find extra lands. So you are going to play against this, and if the math is only working out exactly, then you do have to be aware of this card, because players will play this thing just as a very cheap cantrip. And because there are a bunch of cards that care if you cast spells, like the Prowess creatures, spells on the opponent's turn, like the Cutthroat. There's a mythic red enchantment that makes giant dragons every time you cast a non-creature spell. So yeah, you're going to run into this card, and you need to be aware of it just because it will throw off the math by exactly 1, and sometimes that's good enough. High Fae Trickster is a 4 mana, 4 power flash flyer. It only has 2 toughness, but its real threat is the combination of a sudden large flying creature and the ability to give all of your other spells flash. So when this thing is in play, everything in their hand is a combat trick or surprise creature, potentially. So that's a problem, but more importantly, this thing coming down at the end of the opponent's turn and now getting to attack for 4 against that opponent, that is a huge flyer that they now have to deal with. It only has 2 toughness, so it's probably pretty easy to kill, but if they don't have flyers, that's 4 points of unblockable damage. They need to find a removal spell for that. So this thing you have to be worried about on both the front of it's just a large flyer out of nowhere, and giving all of their other things flash. Also, it can trade with things like Sarah Angel, where you thought you were just going to attack with your big scary angel and get in for damage, and now you're down your angel for their 4 mana spell. So that's another thing to be aware of. But yeah, large flying creatures with flash tend to win games out of nowhere because it's a lot like having haste, as long as you can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn and then untap with it. And it's an evasive threat, so it does a lot of work in that regard. What do we have next? High Fate Trickster. Next up is Refute. Get to skip over all of these fun cards. And there's Refute. So, this is the one that is most easy to punish a player for trying to leave up. Refute is 3 mana, and if you're not spending 3 mana on your turn, it better be because Refute is the only card in your hand that does, like, that you can realistically hold up and cast at this point, or you have a bunch of spells that you can cast at instant speed, and Refute is one of them. Like I said, this set does have a lot of flash spells, in blue-white especially, so it's a lot easier to leave up mana and still be able to do something. But Refute is cancel with the added ability that you get to loot when you cast it. So, do not play your spells into Refute if you don't have to. You want to waste your opponent's 3 mana. Unlike the Essence Scatter, where you might want them to cast it on your 2 or 3 because you don't want them to leave it up on later turns where they can cast like a 4-drop on 6 mana and still have up a counterspell. So that way you can top deck your scary thing. This one, you just want to make them waste their mana. Like, if they're leaving up 3 mana every single turn and not countering stuff, and not spending their mana to develop out to the board, then they are probably losing that game if you have a board presence. Like, they're not going to be able to recover. They're going to have to tap out for, like, creatures eventually or something in order to stabilize their board, and then they're going to be vulnerable to your larger spells, and in the meantime, if you can force them to hold up Refute without actually getting to spend their mana, then they are losing a lot of tempo for doing so. Runaway Together. So, it does require 2 targets controlled by different players, so they do have to have a creature in order to bounce your creature. But past that, Runaway Together has been one of those cards that has been very potent in the limited formats it's in, because you can usually find a creature with a good comes into play ability to bounce, or it can be used to counter removal while tempoing out the opponent, bouncing your creature that was going to die and their expensive creature that they can't recast because they just spent their mana on removal. Can do a lot of tempo shifting. So you do have to be aware of Runaway Together as another, similar to Mischievous Pup, it saves their creature while wasting a lot of your mana. So, now granted, it doesn't leave a body on the table, but it also leaves you down a body. So the 1 mana less is going to be a factor there too. After Runaway Together, we have Spectral Sailor. This one is just, it's a 1/1 with flash. Its relevance as a flash creature is primarily that it can come down and block a creature mid-combat when you had lethal beforehand. Past that, it's primarily just going to be, oh, I didn't need to cast it right now, so I'm going to flash it out the end of your turn, and then I'm going to draw some cards at a later point in time. Like, most of the time, it's not going to be a factor that it has flash, past that it can suddenly show up in the middle of combat where you had a lethal attack and now you don't. Think Twice is another card draw spell. Yeah, all of the card draw spells let the opponents leave up mana to cast their counters and whatnot, and then still do something if you don't present a counter, like a valid target for the counter spell. The problem is that they're not developing out to the board, so they're usually not much of a factor as far as what you need to be worried about when they're leaving up mana. You just need to be aware that it might be a card draw spell instead, and that's what's holding priority on Arena or something. Next up is Time Stop, which goes to the extreme opposite end of holding up mana for counters and card draw. So, it ends the turn. If your opponent has this, and they're not casting it just to time walk you, like cast it during your upkeep so that you don't get your draw step, and they just go to their turn, then what they're trying to do is effectively counter your spell and end your turn at the same time. So if they're leaving up all of that mana to do this, This is another one of those where you want to attack into them, and the Aetherize is going to really mess with that. You want to do your attacks first, so that way you got your card draw and your attack step before you cast a spell, so that way if they're using this as a counter spell, they're trying to time walk plus counter spell, you're going to get most of your turn out of that. So if they're going to be that greedy, that's how you try to mess with them at least a little bit, but it's still effectively a 6 mana instant speed time walk, so there's not a whole lot of playing around that. But like I said, if they're trying to get greedy, if they really want to counter the spell on top of that, then you just don't let them. But you're probably playing around Aetherize more than you're playing around this one, so... And they should just be using it to time walk you, like 90% of the time. Uncharted Voyage, we've been getting variations on this one. In fact, I think this one plays exactly like the Duskmourn one. Very similar to the Seas from Slumber. So, Uncharted Voyage is target creature's owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library and you surveil one. This is Blue's typical creature removal spell at instant speed. Since it can't outright kill things, it puts them in like, either they go away for a turn or they just go away. And either way, it's a 1-for-1 trade, because either you have to spend your turn drawing your creature again and recasting it, or it's at the bottom of your deck, and therefore they traded their instant for your creature effectively. But yeah, that is one of Blue's reactionary cards, and that is the last blue card. Alright, that brings us to Black. So Black did not get a ton of instant speed creature removal. In fact, Black has, I think, the least number of instant speed cards. So Baked into a Pie is one of their actual removal spells that they can cast at instant speed in order to kill your creature. Normally, Black has like 3 or 4 of these, so the fact that their one kill a creature just straight up at instant speed is a 4 mana spell instead of a 3, it's not a Doomblade or a Murder, it's a 4-drop, is going to be a factor for determining whether or not your opponent can kill your creatures, like just outright kill them at instant speed. It does give them a food token, so in the late game, this is 6 mana, kill a creature, gain 3 life, which can really throw off a lethal attack. But past that, it's just a 4 mana, kill a creature. So, next up is Blasphemous Edict. I'm including this as a Wrath because, let's be honest, people don't normally have 14 creatures in play. This is going to be a Wrath. So, the trinket text of if there are 13 or more creatures on the battlefield, like, that's not even going to come up. How often do you have, like, 6+ creatures and your opponent has 6+ creatures? Because you need, like, somebody needs to be at least 7 creatures and somebody else needs to be at 6 in order for there to be 13 on the battlefield for this to cost a single mana. It'll happen from time to time, but it doesn't happen very often. But each player sacrifices 13 creatures. So it's effectively a 5 mana Wrath. In almost every situation that you're likely to encounter, it's a 5 mana Wrath, and every once in a great while it will be a 1 mana Wrath plus a follow-up creature. And there'll be like a fraction of a percentage chance that it's not quite a Wrath. You play around that the same way you play around the other Wraths. Unless you're at, like, if you're at 13 creatures, you might want to cast a 14th one against the person playing black but not white, so that way you can keep your best creature. But yeah, past that, it's playing around a Wrath. Next up is Fake Your Own Death. So this is a reprint. This is the third time this card has got reprinted, because it was already a reprint in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It is the buff a creature, and when that creature dies, it returns to the battlefield. In this case, it makes a treasure. Black has been getting these for set after set after set. Most of the time, they usually don't come up. This is not the one that players use. Black is very short on instant speed interaction, though. So if they're not getting good instants from their other color, then they might have to run this just because they don't have a lot of interaction and they need a trick. Something that will save their creature from a removal spell, let it win combat effectively because it'll come back, makes a treasure so it can fix their mana if they have a splash card in their deck. But for the most part, you usually don't run into this one that often, but just be aware it is one of Black's tricks in the set. Next up is Seeker's Folly, which I think is a sorcery, but I'm not sure. Let's double check. It's on the list. Yes, it is a sorcery. It's on the list because it has the mode of giving all of your opponent's creatures -1/-1. So it kills all of your 1 toughness creatures. It also makes your other creatures worse in combat. Depending on the math will determine if they need to cast this pre-combat or post-combat. If you have a lot of 1 toughness creatures, they're going to cast this pre-combat to make all of your blocks bad and take away a lot of your potential blockers. If it's not that obvious, then they might attack with their creatures. If they're attacking with like a 4/4 into your 5/5, be aware of this card, because this is one of the things that they might have. If all the advantageous blocks have all of your guys living at 1 toughness afterwards, just think about this card and think if you have other options to block with, because it's not like they can cast it in the middle of combat to shrink your guys. Since it's attached to a discard spell, they decided not to allow for that. And our last black instant is Stab. It is an instant speed -2/-2 effect. So I know we've had this before, and I forget what it was called now, but for like the instant speed version, as opposed to it being the enchantment version, drag down, deadweight. Deadweight is the enchantment version. This is the instant version, and I know we've seen it before at 1 mana, and I can't remember what it was called at the time. But this is one of those ones that allows you to win combat. 5/5 versus 4/4. Now the 4/4 is actually going to live, and their creature is going to die. Being able to kill one of the 3 creatures that is multi-blocking the large creature, and just being able to kill a 2 toughness creature at any point in time for 1 mana. You're going to run into this one every time you're playing against Black. As long as it was in their pool, they should have taken at least one of them. And it's going to get you because it's a removal spell. So just be aware of it and try and minimize the impact it can have. But that's the best we're going to be able to do with that one. It's way too efficient at what it's doing to not kill a creature at some point in time, and probably in a way that's frustrating for you when you're on the receiving end of it. So we get to red. Red has a braid. So 3 damage to a creature, or destroy target artifact. I don't remember there being a large number of artifact creatures in this set, but just keep in mind that your artifact creatures that are out of range of their 3 damage burn spells, and there are a couple of them, like 3 to 4 damage burn spells in the set, are still in range of just being destroyed outright by a braid. Also, if you have, I think there's an artifact that, is there an artifact anthem? It's not the Patchwork Banner. I'm trying to remember now if there's an artifact that buffs your team. Yeah, the Banner of Kinship, potentially. I knew there was one that, it looked like a Bloomburrow card because it's got all the mice hanging out together. And it can suddenly go away and take away all of its buffs with it, so if you're leaning on a card like that, just be aware of a braid's existence for that effect. Next is Bulk Up. So there have been cards that give Double Strike. This one is not that, but if the creature is unblocked or has trample, it's going to feel an awful lot like the same difference. So bulk up doubles a creature's power until end of turn. Also notably, it flashes back for 6 mana, so on 8 mana, it can quadruple the creature's power, it can double it, and then double the doubled power for a 4 times boost. So, if your opponent has a lot of mana, be aware of this card, and how much damage it can potentially do if a creature gets through unblocked, or if it can target 2 separate creatures. But just be aware of it, like, don't let the 4 power creature through when you're at 8 because you're going to kill them on the crackback. Be aware that it might be a card like this, and you might actually have to block. It also could be a card like this, Burst Lightning, which is red to cast to deal 2 damage, and kicker 4 to upgrade it to 4 damage. Notably, for newer players, this one goes to any target. This is a reprint from the original Zendikar block, and we've been getting a lot more burn that only goes to creatures like a Braid, or that only goes to opponents like Boltwave here. Getting burn that goes anywhere is among Red's strongest cards in any given set. So you do have to be aware of Burst Lightning and the fact that it can deal 4 damage to you out of nowhere, and that it can kill your creatures. And it can very efficiently kill, like, smaller creatures for 1 mana. So it's a shock with strictly better upside in that it can also upgrade to 4 damage for an extra 4 mana. Next up for red, we have Chandra. So Chandra makes the list for her -4. Because she starts on 6 loyalty, you can drop her and immediately -4 to get this effect. She deals 8 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers. That's a lot of damage to throw around out of nowhere, and it can very easily wipe out a lot of your smaller creatures or one of your big creatures, or a big creature and a bunch of small creatures. So Chandra functions a lot like a Plague Wind type effect, where she just comes down and kills a whole lot of the opponent's creatures and clears up the board for attacking, makes it easier to survive the counterattack if they need to hold back blockers because they're still a little low on life. So yeah, you have to be aware of Chandra as a potential top deck that will try to Plague Wind your board. If you're worried about Chandra, the types of things you need to take into account are what does the math look like for her when she can divide up 8 points of damage? Can you put down something where she won't get to kill most of your creatures because she'll have to dump all of her damage into that one if she shows up? Things like that. Or going even wider so that way it's harder for them. Or holding up your instant speed like Claws Out so that way if they do top deck a Chandra or one of the other mass burn spells that we'll see later on the list, you can protect your stuff that way. So that's Chandra. Fiery Annihilation is next. Red and 2 deals 5 damage to target creature. Again, we see the only dealing damage to creatures that we're more used to. It can exile up to 1 target equipment attached to that creature, and if that creature would die, exile it instead. So, very similar to the thing I said before about make your move suddenly making the creature vulnerable. Fiery Annihilation being able to kill the creature and exile the equipment attached to it, and of note, the equipment will not save the creature. Unless it's specifically Swiftfoot Boots that will stop it from being the target of the spell to begin with. If the equipment is giving a toughness boost or indestructible, those are going away when Fiery Annihilation exiles the equipment. Unless it's the triggered ability from the 1 equipment from white, which I believe gives it to the creature until end of turn, it's not going to save the creature anymore. I don't think that comes up now. There's no, like, Darksteel Plate did not get reprinted, and we don't have, like, a Mithril code or anything, but it will actually knock the equipment off. So if the equipment is giving a toughness boost or something, the equipment is going away also. So Fiery Annihilation is still a factor at that point, and will probably still kill the creature. So just be aware of that one. And also, like I said, if moving the equipment to your guy suddenly makes you lose the equipment and your guy, that's going to be a real feel bad. So just be aware that that's a possibility if you're playing against red, that they might kill your guy and your equipment instead of only one or the other, like a braid. Alright, after this comes Goblin Surprise. So this is the one that can make 2/1/1s. It can also give creatures +2/+0 until end of turn. So it is a mass pump effect or 2 bodies. This is one of the more versatile versions of this spell. Being able to make creatures when you don't have enough is a big game, or to be able to suddenly have 2 chump blockers when the race is close and you need to block 2 creatures and not die and not lose the rest of your creatures to attack back. Those are factors. It can also allow you to block with smaller creatures and pump your team, or attack your smaller creatures into the bigger creatures. When they're attacking, this plays a lot like the Claws Out, where you just have to be aware that it could be a mass pump spell and block accordingly. Like, don't trade off your 5/5 for their 3/3. Because that's going to be a real feel bad if you didn't need to do that in order to live. Alright. Next up is Hidetsugu's Second Right. The fact that this thing is an instant almost doesn't matter. The opponent has to be at exactly 10, and this will kill them. The only factor to be aware of with this card's existence is that if you can go to 9 instead of 10, consider that. Just very briefly. Hidetsugu's Second Right has never been a particularly good card for limited. It's been okay in constructed, where you can sculpt your deck with different damage amounts, so that way you can get your opponent to exactly 10 in order to kill them. Because this does nothing if they're at 11 or 9. Like, this card is not particularly good, but some people will play it. So just be aware that if you can go to 9 instead of 10 by letting through a 2/2 instead of a 1/1, maybe do that. Just so that way you don't randomly lose to this incredibly bad card. Yeah, I know it saw play in Constructed where you had a lot more ability to sculpt the damage that you were going to deal to your opponents, but in Limited you don't have that level of control, so... And if your opponent knows Hidetsugu's Second Right is a thing, then they might be able to dance around going to 10, and if they can pull that one off, especially by going to, like, 9, then it actually makes this a dead card in the opponent's hand. So... that is a factor. Next up is Seismic Rupture. So this deals 2 damage to each creature without flying. It is bad Pyroclasm unless you have small flyers and your opponent doesn't. So you play around this one the same way you play around Pyroclasm. And a little bit of a factor is making sure that you don't... very similar to not losing your 5/5 to their 3/3 with the +2 power trick. You also don't want to lose your 5/5 to their 3/3 because they're playing Seismic Rupture afterwards and they were going to lose a bunch of their attackers anyway. So they just attacked with everything, hope that they could kill all of your creatures with a Seismic Rupture, or our next card, Slagstorm, which is a rare version of Seismic Rupture and can deal 3 damage to each creature or to each player. So both of these cards are playing in the same space, in that they will deal damage to every creature in play. The Seismic Rupture is a little bit worse on all fronts, unless, like I said, you have a bunch of little flyers. Also, the Slagstorm can suddenly deal 3 damage to players, so it can kill you if you get too low on life. But past that, you are mostly worried about playing out a lot of little creatures and losing them to one of these 2 red board wipes. So just be aware that there are 2 different red mass damage effects that can kill smaller creatures, and play your creatures out accordingly. After Slagstorm, we get Shore Strike. This is the 2-mana one that gives +3 power in first strike. We've been getting a lot of the +1 power in first strike and sometimes scry 1 in a lot of sets lately. We're back to the 2-mana +3/+0 in first strike. It wins combat almost every single time. Like, it's very hard to block in a way that Sure Strike will not win combat. It's a little more expensive, though. I can also just randomly tack on 3 damage, so be aware of that if you let unblock creatures through. That this is another way that they can add extra damage, but if you're worried about the surprise goblins, then you're probably playing around Sure Strike as best you can also. Throw of Possibility is a card draw spell in red, so again, it's more that this could be what they're holding up if they're getting priority with like 2 mana. It might not be Sure Strike, it might be Thrill, but you just have to be aware of it because it's another instant that could be in their deck. Alright, that brings us to green. First up is the appropriately named Ambush Wolf. It is a 3-mana 4/2, and when it enters, it exiles up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So there is a Zombify, there's like a 4 or 5 mana Animate Dead card in the set. So if you're playing that card and you're trying to get some decent creatures into your graveyard, just be aware that this thing will in fact eat your corpses before you get to reanimate them. It will also come out of nowhere and trade with your 4/4. Right, Apothecary Stomper that gain life instead, or this poor little 3-mana 3/3 that could jump up to a 4/3 with trample. Yeah, it's still not living through Ambush Wolf. So yeah, green could suddenly have a surprise 4-power creature. It's not as bad as the fairy, where a creature comes down at the end of your turn and now they have an extra attacker, unless you don't have blockers. Because while it doesn't have an evasion ability, it can still jam for 4 damage, and that might be good enough. So just be aware of it for that factor also. Bite Down is an instant speed punch effect. So the creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, or Planeswalker, when that comes up. And there are more than the 1 Planeswalker that we've been having lately. I believe there are 5 this set also. As is tradition for core sets. So, Bite Down is the thing that will let the green deck suddenly kill your creature out of nowhere. Broken Wings is another one of those catch-all cards that has a lot of different middling targets, so that way, if you run it, I don't think there are enough artifacts and enchantments that you need to kill that Broken Wings is going to be main deck in best of 1. So unless there's a blue-white skies deck or something that's really running through all of the events where you need to have a way to kill a flyer more often than not, this one shouldn't be a factor in best of 1. Be aware of it, though, for best of 3. This is the card that green will side in to kill your really cool artifact or enchantment, or knock one of your flyers out of the air. And at that point, it functions like any of the other removal spells that can also disenchant. After Broken Wings comes... right. Giant Growth has come back. So, Giant Growth is one of those cards... It's from Alpha Beta and Unlimited originally. It's 1 mana, it's +3/+3 until end of turn. This thing wins almost every combat. It is so hard to not lose your creature to Giant Growth. That it's just, there's no real playing around it. It's more a question of, can you get them to use it early when they have it. This is the type of card that I love to trade my 2/2 for this 1 mana trick, by blocking like your 2/1 or something, or your 1/1 or anything to make you use Giant Growth now, because this thing scales with the game. Like, your 7/7 Trampler is going to live through getting blocked by 3 different creatures and overkilling it by 2 points of damage. It's just, and it's 1 mana, it's so efficient. So that is Green's trick for the set, and that's the one that you need to be most aware of. The other ones are less of a factor than this one, just because it's so mana efficient. Speaking of other tricks, Inspiring Call. So there's a +1/+1 counter sub theme in this set, and Inspiring Call will save all of your creatures that have 1/1 counters on them from either combat or being destroyed, and lets you draw a card for each of those creatures. Um, so Green might treat this as a mass card draw spell. So your ideal situation is a lot like the other ones where their creature is like all of their creatures are suddenly indestructible. It's like, okay, well, if I blocked as best I could to play around all of the other cards, then them suddenly becoming indestructible isn't going to matter as much. So again, it's just another card you need to be aware of. I don't think this one's going to show up as often, but there, like I said, there is a +1/+1 counter theme in the set, so you might run into it. After that one is Snakeskin Veil. So Snakeskin Veil is Giant Growth saves the creature from combat all the time. Snakeskin Veil saves the creature from removal spells, target removal spells all the time. It's less likely to win them combat, but it is way more likely to dodge a removal spell for their awesome creature. So you do have to be aware that for cards like Snakeskin Veil, this is where you're incentivized to play your sorcery speed removal on like your, or not sorcery speed removal, your instant speed removal on your turn, as though it were sorcery speed, because letting the opponent untap gives them the potential to be able to interact with your spells, and nowhere is that more of an issue than Snakeskin Veil, because it's not even going to eat up their mana anymore. Like, they might have tapped out to cast their big guy because they didn't want to wait to get another land. So now would be the best time to kill their creature before they untap and show you that they did in fact have or drew Snakeskin Veil. But past that, it's not really that easy to play around. Leaving up a green mana to save their creature all the time is just something that's going to happen. And I believe we are done. Yes, there are no wraths and no flash spells in the gold cards and in the artifacts. And this thing doesn't have flash. So that's going to do it for my pre-release prep video then. Yeah, a lot of it is just knowing that the cards exist and what the opponents can do with their available mana. So if you know that Giant Growth and Snakeskin Veil are both potential cards that your opponent can have, then you want to like block in a way that forces them to Giant Growth if it's Giant Growth, and then you can kill it with your instant speed removal spell. And if it's not Giant Growth, then the Snakeskin Veil is either going to make it a trade, and now you can save your removal spell for something else, or it's just combat's going to happen the way it's going to happen then. So, and then you can worry about Snakeskin Veil on subsequent turns. So, yeah, that's basically how I get ready for pre-releases. I just need to know all these cards. There are so many white and blue instant speed spells this time around. It's going to make playing against a blue-white like aggro control deck a lot more frustrating because they have so many different options for what their cards could be. But past that, I think we're just going into a normal core set where a lot of things are just the simplest and straightforward version of the card. And a lot of the cards are just going to be, does this card generate some sort of card advantage for you? Is this card functionally a 2-for-1 or better? And the more of those cards you can get in this set, the better you're going to be doing. More so than I think in other sets, because everything is just very straightforward. So there's not a whole lot of, I'm going to draft a highly synergistic deck like we have been doing lately. There's going to be a lot more, as long as the cards are kind of all going in the same direction, you don't necessarily need to draft around a specific strategy. Like, your cards will just get you there. So individually powerful cards and cards that get you 2-for-1s or better are going to have a lot more power in this format. But yeah, that's going to do it for me for right now. I hope this helps you with your pre-release, and I thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.